Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. We're here with Stream to talk about the World Championship that is coming up for Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, as well as in the TCG. And we're going to be discussing in this episode the best decks for the upcoming event, and what I expect to do well. Now, first of all, we gotta talk about the format, because it's a little bit weird. First and foremost, the decks are a bit interesting. They're based on the July 14th ban list, which was not too long ago, with the upcoming selection pack that included Labyrinth. So it's basically Labyrinth and the future for those decks. But the idea is you use up to 2 decks, and then you can at most use 3 copies of any card across all 3 of those, or all of those decks across the 3-person team, which is 6 decks in total, because each person has 2 decks. So I'll explain it a little bit better in a second. However, you do all get 3 shared cards across all of the decks that you can utilize. So what does this look like? Right here, this is what it looks like. So you can choose your 3 shared cards, obviously Ash Blossom Maxi, and then whatever other card it may be. So we have ourselves the Zeus here. This was a tournament hosted by App Media with the WCS format. And as you can see here, we have Labyrinth and Runic for this individual player. And as you can see, there's not a single shared card among them outside of the other cards that they could share, like Zeus, which actually just isn't played at all in this, like Zeus or Maxi or Ash. Here's a better example. So we have Ash Blossom here, we have the Maxi here. But as you can see, nothing else is shared along these decks, as well as not between any of these decks. None of the cards are shared. They're all different. Next up, we have ourselves, these the Sprite and the Exo Sister. Again, no shared cards. They're all very different, except for the cards that they designated to be playable or to be shared. And then, of course, we have more cards and more decks from other people, Exo Sister, Tier, stuff like that, right? So that's the format. That's kind of how it functions. It's a team format as well, and it's a round robin. I believe it's first to 5 game wins or something like that. I think. Let me make sure. First stage is a round robin. Split the team into 2 groups. Qualify. Total rounds 1, and then I believe it's how many is it? A match between 2 teams is called a round, which consists of each player. Duel against, therefore, sets of 3 simultaneous duels for 9 duels maximum. The winner of the round is the team that won the most duels. However, a team won 5 or more duels by the end of the second set. They are therefore already won the round, and the third set will not be played. So yeah, it's basically first to 5. So first team to 5 wins the match. So with that in mind, and with all of that said and done, let's rank all of the decks that could even remotely see play under this ban list. Now, you got to keep in mind that a lot of cards are going to need generic staples that may make it a little bit more problematic to slot into other decks, or like as another option, right? And on top of that, the format doesn't say that you have to play both of your decks. You can only play one deck if you wanted to. If you just wanted to max out your tier deck, just play tier, you could absolutely do that. That wouldn't need to be changed. You could just play tier, you could just play whatever you wanted to play, and you didn't even have to touch your other deck. Your other deck could be just there for show, right? But at the very least, you could have it as an option. So that's something to keep in mind. So we're going to go through these, I believe they're in alphabetical order, mostly, and talk about what are good decks to play and what are not. Abyss Actor, pretty simple. It's everything else. It's not going to be very good, right? The problem with Abyss Actor is just exponential. It does kind of nothing. It kind of relies on your opponent not knowing what the deck does for it to gain advantage. And it's a slow pendulum deck and a myriad of other things. It's just not really good enough, and I don't really see it being reliable. Next up, we have Adamantipator. Adamantipator, as you saw, actually showed up quite a bit. It was here. It was in, I believe, every single one of the topping decks. Oh, no, it wasn't. It's in, I believe, all of the other teams. Yeah, here's another Adamantipator. I believe every single team had an Adamantipator player. So out of those top 4, 3 of the 4 had Adamantipator. I do think Adamantipator is pretty good, mostly due to the fact that you can basically play a full-on combo deck, relying very little on generic cards, and just play these very, specific cards to the archetype that make it a little bit better. I wouldn't say it's in tier 1, but the fact that it is a good secondary deck to just, guarantee, oh, hey, I'm going to go first, I'm going to automatically win, due to the fact that I get to just combo off and not really have to rely on anything. The biggest problem is Maxi, obviously, and with everyone choosing that as their shared card, of course it's going to be a problem. Next up, we have Agnister. Agnister has a problem, where if you want to play Agnister, you basically can't play any other Cybers card, or any other Cybers deck, which I don't think is necessarily bad, but I also just don't think that it's really all that great. It also does require a lot of staples. Most of the time you're playing a lot of hand traps and stuff like that, so it does make it a little bit worse in the way that it functions. And since a lot of people are playing not really standard lists, I would imagine things like kaijus and lava golems and stuff like that are pretty easy to find. So I don't really think that that would be the greatest of options. It's very situational and could definitely do well. I just don't see it being all that great of an option. Maybe as a side deck, maybe as a secondary deck or something like that, but as a primary, not all that great. Next up, we have a similarly problematic deck, this being, I'm actually going to put it here, this being Ancient Warriors. Ancient Warriors is a great going second deck and can OTK very efficiently. However, it does require, again, a lot of staples. Things like kaijus, things like lightning storms and Harpy's feather dusters and stuff like that, which could eat up resources from other decks that you may want to use instead. However, if you're not planning on using a lot of those other cards, it would be good to have that going second deck as an option, right? For example, if your deck is like Adamantipator, maybe it might be good to switch it up and play the Ancient Warrior. Hard to say. I still think it's situational, but not the greatest. Blackwing is just it's too one note and simple. Again, needing a lot of generic cards, and kind of does similar combo stuff to like Adamantipator, just worse. Its combo is significantly easier to deal with, especially with things like Dark Ruler being a little bit more common, and like a myriad of different cards that you have to deal with, which this doesn't really deal with very well. Like, for example, how well is it going to do against the, top performing Labyrinth or Runic Stun deck? It's not going to go very well. So it's also pretty inconsistent. Exactly. Blue Eyes is Blue Eyes. I'm not going to talk about that one. I believe this is just branded. I'm not going to randomly see like another branded in here somewhere. Branded is by far one of the better decks here. It does require you to play your Bestials and stuff like that, but the reason I'm going to put it so high is because you can play it either as branded tier or just as pure branded, or you can play it as like branded Bestial, or you can play it in a whole bunch of different ways that allow it to generate additional advantage and kind of fill up slots that you normally wouldn't. Oh, you didn't open Simoon or Black Whirlwind? Guess you die. Yeah. So branded is a very good option just in general for that, giving you the ability to kind of like fill out your decks with a decently powerful deck. And it can be a primary deck for a player as well, which could do well in almost every situation. It's probably one of the best decks currently of the format, so I am going to put it pretty high. Next up, we have what I would imagine to be Stun. Stun is honestly pretty good. Again, if we go over here, Stun is just a nice second deck option to give you the ability to kind of like slow your opponent down and not take up a whole bunch of resources, right? You can play Lava Golems, you can play Kaijus, you can play whatever it may be, and it's still going to do fairly decently without really relying on too much from like other resources, right? Is that a burn deck? Yes. Next up, we have Access Code, which I would imagine is like Code Talker, which is, very similar in nature to Agnister. Crystal Beast. This one's also going to be situational. Again, it's kind of like a stun deck, but a worse version of a stun deck. If you have a really good player, maybe it's worth it. Most of the time, I'm going to say that it's probably not worth it. I'm actually just going to put this down here. I just don't think it's worth it. Cyber Dragon just doesn't cut it. Neither does Dark Magician. Dark World, notably. Yeah, Dark World is available. Dark World is interesting. I don't think it's all that good because we don't have Silva, and the combo that it makes, like the stuff that it does, the looping of cards out of your hand, which is much more difficult now. Dark World feels so mad in Master Duel. Yeah, it really does. I'm gonna actually just put this in everything else. I really don't think that it's good. Especially in a format like this where it's like every deck needs to be a powerhouse, you can't have something that kind of works. You gotta have something that is extremely good. Or this could be your secondary deck and you're never going to use it. Almost the entire extra deck is generic. That's also true. DDD is a bad Pendulum deck. I don't know. Dinomorphia. I'm going to put Dinomorphia actually pretty high. Dinomorphia, notably, doesn't really require anything generic in either the extra deck or the main deck to actually function. A lot of its interaction is very specific. However, it is very easy to deal with for a lot of different decks. And if your opponent has 2 decks to potentially deal with Dinomorphia, it's probably going to be worse for you. However, I still do think that this has a lot of potential, mostly to be a additional deck to play with, to just kind of fill out, again, additional slots. It's not going to take up too much. You can play the devastation or the viruses and stuff like that. So I do think that it's a good option. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Next up, we have Dino for a similar reason. I think that you could play Dino or Dinomorphia for basically the same thing, kind of doing different things though. Dinosaur doesn't really require any of the generic cards that a lot of other decks do, and it can kind of just play through most stuff naturally by itself without any generic cards or anything like that. As long as you have, Ash, Maxi, yada yada, you should be fine. So yeah, Dino, and I mean, UCT is an absolute powerhouse. This can be going either first or going second, which makes it really interesting. However, its power level isn't really as high as it could be, and it does lose to Max C, which is a bit of a problem. Next up, we have Dogmatica. Dogmatica, I'm going to put pretty low, mostly due to the fact that it does require specific extra deck cards that would also see use in other decks, right? So the branded cards, the I guess since you can play up to 3, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. But I also just think that it's not really all that great, especially with tier running around. If you go Albazoa, activate the effect, and then you get to go dump Kit Kalos, dump Rukalos, dump a whole bunch of other cards to their graveyard for free, that doesn't seem like a very good idea, right? Next up, we have Dragon Link. Dragon Link is going to go clear down here. Here's the problem. Here is the biggest problem with Dragon Link. Twofold. 1, it needs Bestials. Bestials are much better suited for branded or as generic hand traps for most other decks, right? And 2, a lot of its cards are generic. It needs things like Baron, Warlord Savage, Chaos Ruler, what's the other one? Things like Dark, etc. that really are almost necessary for the deck to function. Yes, it can also play a different deck entirely without all of those generic cards, but I really do think that it is very much more situational. It does kind of need those generic cards. It does kind of, it's very situational because it does steal those Bestials. You could also just be like, oh, I'm going to make it so that I play branded and Dragon Link, and the third card is going to be Lubellion, so that I can play both branded and regular Bestial. And then we can share the Lubellion, or we can share Magnemite or something like that. Kind of hard to say. I just don't really think it's worth it. Do Exosister not next? I want to hear what you have to say. No, Exosister, fine. Exosister. Exosister, honestly, it's actually pretty good. Mostly, I'm going to put it at top of tier 2. I don't think it's quite as high. Yeah. Exosister is very hit or miss, but it doesn't really require any very powerful generic cards. You can kind of just slot in as many cards as you need. You could play it as a control or I guess not combo, but you can either play hand trap control or trap card control. And most of its extra deck is specific to Exosisters, so you're not stealing from anyone. You can basically play only Exosisters in your extra, which is fantastic. So yeah, Exosister is good. I feel like I should put it higher, but I also really don't. We'll put it here. Sure. Dragon Maid. Dragon Maid's just bad. Drytron is interesting. So Drytron I could see being similar in nature to Adamancipator. However, the problem is that it does actually require you to have to basically have more outs to max C. So you have to play additional called buys and stuff like that, which means that they would kind of eat up the called buys and other such cards to out the max C. And I do also think that the Drytrons lose very hard to Bestials, but with less Bestials running around, it could be better. So this one's hard to say. I kind of want to put it higher because honestly, having a ritual deck that doesn't really rely on any of the other generic cards makes it pretty decent, and its boss monsters are, again, still very good. I mean, we still have 2 Benten, we still have 3 Ava. You can still basically play the infinite negates, the infinite negate cards, and you might come across less things like Dark Ruler or Droplet to actually deal with that. So it's an option. I think that it definitely could be good, but I do think it is a bit situational depending on the other decks that you want to play. Earth Machine is actually just pretty good. I'm just going to put it in tier 2. Again, it doesn't really require any other cards that most other decks would need, right? Yeah, basically the entire deck and extra deck are specific to that one, meaning you can basically play anything else with this. Even something like Adamantimator you could play with Earth Machine, which is kind of funny. That's how different they are in terms of cards that they want to play. Next up we have Eldritch. Eldritch is... I'm going to put down here, again, in situational. I think it's fine. It can be one of your stall decks. I just don't think that it's like the best of stall decks, but it can also be used with like various different stall strategies or like the more slow control-esque strategies. So I don't think it's bad. I just think that it's not as good. Endymion is just not... Well... Endymion's not bad. Again, no real shared cards, but it is a slow pendulum deck that isn't really like the most consistent, and you really want consistency. So Evil Eye is just bad. I don't know what to say. It's not a good deck. Same with Exodia. Flu Wanderese. I'm genuinely surprised not as many people are playing this because you can play things like DD Crow that search out additional cards. You could play, you know, without Ash or Maxi. You can play... I guess it does eat up, like, the pot of cards. So, like, Pot of Prosperity, Pot of Extravagance, and stuff like that. However, you can definitely work around that. And I do think that this is just overall still a very strong deck. I don't think it's quite that high, but I still think that is a viable option and definitely something to look into. So, yeah. Fur Hire. Sprite, Fur Hire, Runic has a problem. I do think that this is one of the best decks currently of the format in a best of one. I think that this is just very, very strong. However, I'm going to put it a little bit lower. I'm going to put it below Adamantimator. The reason being, it eats up Runic, it eats up Sprite, and it eats up Fur Hire cards. Now, granted, Fur Hire cards doesn't really matter. The Runic cards do matter. Because those means that you can't play like Stun Runic or regular Sprite Runic or anything like that because you're playing this specific variant. And the Sprite cards as well means that you can't play a better Sprite variant. So it's one of those things where it's like, this is actually very powerful and definitely an option that you have available to you, but it just kind of eats up a little bit too many cards to actually really utilize effectively. This format's so weird and it's so janky. Next up, Generator. Generator... It's fine. It's, again, situational. It's mostly inconsistent, but being able to have it as like a side option or like a secondary deck option might be worth it in very specific matchups. So it's like, you know, it's pretty decent against tier, being able to like eat the opponent's cards and not give them the ability to actually utilize said cards. That's pretty good with like Jormungandr and stuff. So I do think that it has some power, and it doesn't like steal cards from other decks. So I think it's fine. Next up, Goaty. Goaty's very situational as well. Similar in nature, where it's like, yeah, it has a pretty decent tier matchup, but again, it's kind of inconsistent, which is the biggest problem. I'm actually going to put this... Nah, yeah, I think it's just situational. Next up, we have Grass, which I would imagine is just like grass-centric decks, which, honestly, I'm actually just going to put this like... I'll put it in situational. I was going to put it in everything else. Grass is a problem because you have to play 60 cards, which means that, again, if you're playing good cards, you're eating up more cards from other players, right? But you could play it with, like, Adamantimator or with Branded or with Tier or something like that. So maybe if you don't have, like, a Branded player in your team, you could play Grass with, like, Branded Tier, and that would be a good option. If like you're the Branded Tier player or something like that. So it's something like that where it could be good, and Grass overall is a decent deck still, but not insane. This is literally not a deck. Same with this one. Hero is just... Actually, Hero is pretty good. Here's the argument with Hero. Hero is a full combo deck for going first. And if you know that you're going first, it's much better. But on top of that, it doesn't really require any other cards. It doesn't require you to have random extra deck monsters that you normally wouldn't have or anything like that. Basically, the entire deck is just heroes. Which means that I actually can put it a little bit higher, even though I don't think the deck's all that good. Just the fact that, like, you can basically auto-win if you go first and get the right hands. And you have the ability to play none of the cards shared by your team. Means that, yeah, it just kind of opens itself up to be actually pretty decent. Card Recurry is just bad. Labyrinth is probably one of the best decks, if not the best deck for this format, besides Tier, I would say maybe. Tier and Sprite. Because it is a control deck that doesn't share cards. Right? So as you can see here, lots of Labyrinth as well was in this event. Yeah, Labyrinth. I think there's another Labyrinth here. Labyrinth. And I think that was it. Oh, yeah. No, all four of the top decks, or all four of the top teams had a Labyrinth deck. So, there you go. Lab, so boring. Lab is way more interesting than a lot of the decks that we've talked about. Madolche kind of just sucks. It's just bad. It takes up the Ishizu cards, which you really don't want. Magical Musketeer is also just bad. Marincess. My issue with it is that it had a secret pack on release. So the selection pack was kind of moot. Sure. Marincess. Marincess I find to be similar in nature to like the Agnister stuff, where it's like it's just going to eat up Cybers cards, like Splash Mage or what have you. So if you're not playing Cybers, it's fine. But it does kind of need a lot of staples to kind of get it going, like pot cards like Pot of Desires and stuff like that. So not the worst, but not the greatest. It's also just a weaker power level. And again, Mathmech goes up here in the situational tier, mostly because of the fact that it is a Cybers. Zombie. Again, I'm going to put this next to Eldritch. Similar in nature, it's like it can be used as your supplementary stun deck or like control deck alongside like the Eldritch stuff and stuff like that. So it's decent. Orchist. Orchist just isn't very good for this format. Orchist requires a lot of very specific cards that I guess not very specific, but it does require like you to be lucky and actually see the cards that you need to see, and it is just inconsistent enough to be like not very good for tournaments. However, it's still okay. It's still a good deck. I just don't think it's really worth it for this format. Melfi is not really worth it. You could play like Melfi Sprite. I guess we could say like this is Melfi Sprite, but the thing is Melfi Sprite is more just regular Sprite at this point, because it's like you should be playing almost always Caddy and Penny in your Sprite deck at this point. Mutants just isn't playable. Runic Naturia. So here's the problem with Runic Naturia. Runic cards are very high priority right now. Runic is probably one of the most highest priority decks currently of the format, mostly due to the fact that they do the interaction of hand traps just like every other deck that would instead play hand traps. You can then just play the Runic cards instead, and they're also a supplementary engine to things like Sprite, Furhire, Naturia, etc. So, Naturia eating up Runic cards, while not also doing an insane job of being like the best deck in the room, means that it's a little bit less worth it. However, Naturia Runic is still very good, and you're not always going to have a Runic deck. So yeah, you can just play Naturia Runic. And if you're good at it, hey, there you go. Numeron, honestly, not that bad. I'm not gonna lie. Just having a going second option that is almost entirely cards that no one else is going to play is pretty good. Yeah, just being able to go Lightning Storm your opponent, and then drop down a Numeron network to OTK after blowing out their back row seems pretty good. Unga Bunga decks do work pretty well. This is more Pendulum stuff. Pendulum stuff is more situational. I really don't see it doing all too well, mostly due to its consistency issues, as well as the fact that it does need to eat up a lot of the generic extra deck slots. So, kind of hard. Pacifist just isn't worth it. Plunder is very interesting. I feel like Plunder is actually sleeper OP. Here's why. You can play generic kaijus, like for example, Raiden or the light kaiju, to give to your opponent, which outs a lot of cards that people would generically be playing, and in a situation like this, that are more problematic. It doesn't really have a bad matchup against anything besides like itself or Ash Blossom, which I do expect to see quite prominently, but it does lose a lot more to more hand traps, and with the lower amount of hand traps due to the fact that they can't share hand traps throughout all of the decks unless they decide to choose like an additional hand trap like Imperm, then you're probably more likely to actually have success with Plunder. On top of that, the extra deck doesn't really require anything in particular. The only thing that I could see as being generic is Almirage. The rest of the cards can entirely be Plunder cards, which actually just work out better for it. So it means that your extra deck is freed up, your main deck is freed up. The only thing that I could see is like being a main deck staple that you kind of need is something like Pot of Desires, but basically everything else can be just fill out cards, right? So I actually do think that this is pretty good as an option. Next up, we have Prank Kid. Prank Kid also needs a lot of really generic cards and is inconsistent due to one Meow Meow Mew and the Adventure Engine being offline and stuff like that, which also takes up the Adventure Engine. So, Punk is also a bit of a problem, also needing generic extra deck monsters, also being a little bit inconsistent. But I do think that it's pretty decent, all things considered. All things considered. So, we'll put it at the top there. Raid Raptor is just not really worth it. It just doesn't do enough, consistently enough. Rika, honestly, is pretty good. I don't think there is a single card that is shared between Rika and, like, any other deck. And since it is such a heavy combo deck, it does mean that you have the ability to... Oh, just kidding. Sorry, hold on. You have the ability to not really rely on other cards, right? So you don't need those like generic hand traps or something like that, like Sprite would. But what's important about sharing cards crossout? No. The format requires you to only have 3 shared cards across all 6 of your decks. So Rika specifically, I think is pretty good, not requiring any of those shared cards, and however, it doesn't have any good back row removal. And with things like Labyrinth and Runic being so premium in this event, I'm going to actually put it below Plunder. Yeah, just not having back row removal means that you are guaranteed to basically have like several bad matchups. Next up, we have Salad. Salad is similar in nature to basically every other Cyber strategy, requiring you to have Cyber's generic monsters, which just, again, it's situational. If you're not playing other Cyber strategies, it's not bad. Although it's probably the worst of the Cyber strategies, but it's still decent. Scareclaw. Scareclaw is very interesting. It does technically not require anything too generic from its shared cards. And it is kind of a combo deck. It does end on like a pseudo Floodgate Towers type thing, so they can't just like out you with Underworld Goddess and stuff like that. I'm gonna put it in tier 2. I think it's pretty decent. Just being able to like set up a big guy every turn and actually have access to some pretty decent follow-up. However, outside of the one kind of gimmick, you're kind of just toast. And you still have access to a myriad of other better decks, but I still think it's good. Shadal. Shadal is interesting for 2 reasons. 1, you can play a pure Shadal version. Playing the control strategy, things like Winda and what have you are able to be played to really slow down the opponent. It's a nice control strategy, similar to the other stun stuff and what have you. However, it can also be paired with things like Tier or Branded to bring it up in terms of power level. So it's one of those things where I'm going to put it in situational, but I do think it is a little bit better than a lot of the other decks available to you, mostly due to the fact that it can be paired with other things. Sky Striker is just not really good for this. It really does need a lot of generic cards, and yes, technically it doesn't need that many, but it's just not... It's like a really weak control deck that does require you to have like either a lot of hand traps or like going second cards, and I just feel like there are better options. This could be your going second deck, or it could be your control deck, but I feel like there are just significantly better options, and I really don't see it being even remotely useful. Next up, we have Sprite. Sprite is, again, one of the better decks of the event. Let's put Runic down here. There we go. Sprite is just incredibly consistent. It does kind of eat up hand traps and stuff like that, but it can also just play basically any 2s and then just go off. It does also eat like Elf, but the thing is Elf is currently at 3, so you could just play 2 Elf in Sprite, and then Elf is still available for another player, so it's not like it's eating too much. Heck, you could even play 1 Elf and have 2 other decks play Elf as well. So, you know, it's not terrible, and yeah, just Sprite is incredibly strong. One of the best decks of the format, so there you go. Next up, we have Spiral. Spiral is very similar in nature to Adamancipator, just a little bit more inconsistent. However, again, not sharing cards, not having generic cards. You can play Droplet in this, which honestly isn't seen play in most other decks. So playing Droplet, honestly, in this deck is actually advantageous, because then you have a way to have Droplet and have an additional out that people may not be prepared for, which is pretty nice. And then on top of that, Spiral is just a good, like, going first full combo deck. So there you go. Stun is right here. I guess this is technically burn and stun. We'll switch them out. Guru is just not really worth it. Same with Suship. Sword Soul. Sword Soul. Where do I put Sword Soul? I'm going to put Sword Soul up here. Sword Soul is... I don't think you share any cards, basically, at all with Sword Soul. So, like, you wouldn't have to split any of your worms. The biggest thing is, like, maybe if you play Pot of Desires or, like, the Bestials with it, but you can absolutely play without the Bestials. You can play, like, the Tennies and stuff like that. So, yeah, I just think that this is a pretty good deck. Don't really have anything else to say. Yeah, I think Sword Soul is very strong. All of its extra deck is basically worms, which aren't really too generic. The biggest problem is Baron, but again, Baron is at 3, so you can take a Baron, and then 2 other people can also take Baron, so it's really not that big of a deal. So yeah, just good. Synchron requires... It dies to a single Ash Blossom, which everyone is going to have, everyone is going to play, and yeah, it's just not really worth it. Tier is probably the best. Tier can be played in so many different ways, with so many different cards, and still succeed. The only problem is it eats the Ishizus. That's it. Shared cards are between 3 players and 2 decks. It's technically between 6 decks, period. So it's between the 3 players. Each 3 players have 2 decks. So it's 6 decks in total. Next up, Weather Painter. Weather Painter's just bad. Therions are interesting. I could see them more as a supportive engine rather than an actual deck, but I still think that they'd be pretty mid. Who gets Max E? Everyone. Because what happens is you get 3 shared cards. So there you go. So you get the 3 shared cards, and everyone can get those across all 6 of the decks. Next up, we have Thunder Dragon. Thunder Dragon is similar in nature, I would say, to the Bestials, or not to the Bestials, to the to Dragon Link. But you could play like Thunder Dragon, Dragon Link, which honestly could be something very good. But again, you know, eating extra deck cards, eating Bestials and stuff like that. So it's not insane, but it's still pretty decent. Toon is just unplayable. Trap Trick, I honestly think, is pretty decent. It can be your control strategy without really having to rely on the like more generic extra deck cards and stuff like that. So I think I think it'll be good, but not insane. Tri Brigade is actually very good. It can be paired with Sprite. It can be played by itself. It can be paired with Lyralisk, none of which require you to play anything in particular besides, you know, the Maxi Ash Blossom. So, yeah, again, pretty decent. It's still a strong deck. Maybe not the strongest, but I'd still put it pretty high. And not having to share anything. It can play a control strategy with like a Zodiac Tri-Brigade as well if you wanted to. So yeah, lots of different things that you can do with this one. True Draco is... it's fine. It's similar to nature and like Eldritch. Same with Kairi Yoshin, Stun. VW. VW is interesting. I feel like VW actually would be pretty good. Not insane, but just decent. Again, not sharing cards, not really being a problem in terms of extra deck space, because most of the extra deck is very specific, and you're not really sharing anything. Maybe like a rank 9 with something like Generator, but yeah, most of the time you're not really going to be sharing anything there, just due to the numbers. Most of the numbers don't line up very well with most of the other decks at the top, so I think Virtual Worlds. I'm gonna put it lower though. I still think it's gonna be pretty good. And then these ones we've already talked about. Here's the problem with Sky Striker. Sky Striker needs too many non-engine pieces, right? So like Sky Striker is decent if you had the ability to access more of your like generic cards across the format, right? So again, Sky Striker isn't as good as like just playing stun, or like a regular other, another control strategy that doesn't specifically require all of those hand traps, right? Yeah, and it also just doesn't do very well against like Labyrinth or Tier or any of these at the top. So it's like it also doesn't have a good matchup. But yeah, I don't think it's terrible. I just like there are so many better options. I don't even see it being like a situational pick. I see it just being a worse version of basically any of these other decks, right? It's like it's not as good of a going second deck as something like even Ancient Warriors, mostly due to the fact that Ancient Warriors doesn't require a myriad of generic cards, so you can just play the going second cards, kind of stick them in there, and stuff like that. So that's it. That's it for the Master Duel list. And yeah, that's going to be it for this episode. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy. If you did, a like is very much so appreciated. And if you want to check out more content like this, as well as more Yu-Gi-Oh!, then just be sure to subscribe. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.